Therapists, what are people afraid to tell you because they think it's weird, but you've heard it many times before? Story 1. The number of people I see who feel like they should grieve in a certain way and are afraid they must not have loved someone or must not have cared is overwhelming. People grieve in many different ways, and the idea of the 5 stages of grief is misleading. I once consulted with another clinician who was working with a couple whose daughter had passed away. The wife believed her husband must not have cared about their daughter because he wasn't outwardly expressing his grief. Meanwhile, she had been attending support groups and openly sharing her emotions. In contrast, her husband found solace in working in the garden he and their daughter had tended to together when she was alive. This was his way of processing and grieving. Both approaches were valid, but society often views one form of grief as more acceptable than another. Ultimately, they found a balance. He began driving her and others to their weekly support groups, and she joined him in the garden on the condition that they didn't talk while working. It was truly heartwarming. Similarly, many people are unaware of their emotions or how to process them. Some only identify with feelings like anger or happiness and think something must be wrong with them if they experience anything else. It's vital to normalize the full range of emotions and learn to recognize how those emotions feel physically in our bodies. Understanding this can be incredibly beneficial in managing and processing feelings. As a society, we have a long way to go in how we treat emotions. Thanks for listening to my TED Talk. Story 2. 2 topics frequently come up in my work. When someone discloses that they were sexually abused as a child, and when someone is experiencing suicidal thoughts. I hear about these issues from clients every single day, so they don't shock me anymore. However, when someone is speaking about these topics for the first time, it's crucial to acknowledge that, while it might be a routine part of my day, it's anything but routine for them. They've often never shared this with anyone before, and it's essential to approach these conversations with care, gentleness, and validation to help them feel safe. Story 3. A common theme among many clients is that they don't know what they enjoy doing. Often they've heard suggestions like, try to do something fun today, or questions like, what do you like to do in your free time? These statements assume that people should already know the answers, but many don't, and that's okay. When I explain to clients that I dislike those statements because they can be unhelpful, I often see them relax, take a deep breath, and say something like, oh, wow, that's so good to hear. I have no idea what I like to do. That's part of the problem. Many feel embarrassed or believe everyone else their age has life figured out, but the truth is, not knowing what you enjoy is incredibly common. I've had this conversation with countless clients, and helping them realize they're not alone is often a huge relief for them. Story 4. Unwanted, intrusive thoughts are completely normal and do not make you a bad person. Yes, even thoughts with sexual, religious, or moral themes. By definition, these are thoughts you don't want, precisely because they conflict with your core values and highlight what you fear or would never want to do. For example, a deeply religious person might experience unwanted blasphemous images, or a new parent might have intrusive sexual thoughts about their baby. While these thoughts are normal, occurring in over 90% of people, their moral nature often leads to intense shame. Many people take years before they feel comfortable enough to talk about them. To clarify, the occurrence of these thoughts, images, or urges is a normal, though unpleasant, brain process. The best way to manage them is to accept them as a natural mental phenomenon and a reflection of the opposite of who you are, meaning you are highly unlikely to ever act on them. Let the thought run its course in the background and gently redirect your attention to something tangible, like what you can see, hear, feel, taste, or touch. For example, I often say to myself, all right, brain, thanks for that thought. I'm going to get back to washing the dishes now and focus on the sound and sensation of the water while you do your thing. I literally say it with a lighthearted tone because I find it genuinely amusing how wild and random my brain can be. Story 4. When I was 14, I struggled deeply with intrusive thoughts, specifically massive anxiety around gore and violence. Seeing anything even remotely related to it, whether it was real, fake, or just implied, like an off-screen death in a movie, triggered my brain to conjure the most awful, horrendous, and vile images. Sometimes these images involve people I knew. The full scope of what I went through is too deep and complex to fully explain here, but it was overwhelming. I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. I was terrified that I'd end up on heavy medication or locked away because of the way my brain worked. I hated those thoughts. I didn't want them, but they would come anyway. I couldn't even look at normal, everyday objects without my brain linking them to some horrific, murderous, or graphic scene. Eventually, I got cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, because these thoughts were completely ruining my life. One of the biggest moments of relief I've ever experienced was when my therapist explained that intrusive thoughts are extremely common and that I wasn't going crazy. Hearing that was life-changing. It was incredibly hard to admit some of the more graphic and upsetting things I was thinking. But when I finally opened up and wasn't met with disgust and was told instead that many people have similar thoughts, I felt so much lighter. Reading your comment reminded me how common this really is, and reassured me once again that I wasn't and still am not weird for experiencing it. Story 5. A personal example from my experience comes from when I was a late 20s male teacher. I spent a couple of years substituting at the high school level before eventually settling into teaching middle school. In the beginning, I found it absolutely horrifying that some students were undeniably sexually attractive. I thought I was a monster and didn't understand why I felt that way. When I brought it up in therapy, my therapist asked me a pivotal question. If you had the chance to have all S with any of them, knowing it was consensual and you'd never get caught, would you do it? Before I could answer, he said, "Don't even worry about answering that out loud. Just ask yourself. If the answer is yes, we should talk about this further. If the answer is no, then you are absolutely 100% normal." He went on to explain that this was a textbook intrusive thought. I could find their appearance sexually arousing while simultaneously being disgusted by the idea of ever acting on it. He emphasized the importance of being honest with myself and ensuring that my hypothetical answer would stay the same, even if there was a 0% chance of getting caught and full consensual participation from the other party. That conversation stuck with me. It helped me recognize that I would never, under any circumstances, act on those feelings, and that reassurance allowed me to move forward. Still, it's a fact of human biology. Someone's appearance might trigger natural arousal, but it's the ability to distinguish thoughts from actions that defines boundaries and morality. Story 6. Clients often become quite fearful of admitting they weren't successful since their last session. This could mean struggling to use a coping skill they're learning about, or not completing a homework assignment I gave them. But the truth is, humans aren't robots, and therapy is hard work. I don't expect perfection from anyone as they begin to make positive changes. Growth takes time, especially when it comes to addressing trauma or deeply held conflicting beliefs. Many clients worry about disappointing me as their therapist. But the truth is, those failure moments are just as important to talk about as the successes. They offer insight into what's working, what's not, and where we can adjust our approach. Therapy isn't about getting everything right every time. It's about showing up, being honest, and committing to the process of growth, even when it's messy. Story 7. I had to learn an important lesson as a client. I have ADHD and struggled immensely with starting and completing my graduate work while pursuing my master's degree. It got so bad that I sometimes made no progress at all, putting my student status in jeopardy. My therapist suggested a way to help me stay accountable. He asked me to text him at the end of each day to let him know what I had accomplished. It sounded like a good idea, but I struggled even with that. After just 2 days, I stopped texting him because I wasn't completing any work and felt too embarrassed to admit it. When I came to my session the following week, I was clearly ashamed. I avoided eye contact and felt like a complete failure. My therapist took one look at me and said, "Dude, you're coming in here looking like you just killed someone or something. It's okay. You're going to make progress, and it's totally fine if you're not successful at first. This is part of the process of learning to improve. You don't need to be scared or embarrassed if you don't succeed right away. If you don't get any work done, just tell me. I'm not going to be mad at you. I'm here to help and encourage you, not judge you." Hearing that was a turning point for me. I realized how much unnecessary pressure I had been putting on myself, even though my ability to function normally was affected by ADHD. My therapist's understanding and reassurance helped me let go of some of that shame. I'm still seeing the same therapist, and he's been instrumental in helping me manage myself and improve over time. I've come a long way since then, and I'm grateful for his support. Story 8. I work with many clients dealing with anxiety and trauma. When I ask them if they describe their experience as anxious about being anxious, I often get an enthusiastic, OMG, yes. Anxiety has such a profound physical impact. Heart pounding, trouble breathing, feeling faint or cold, tunnel vision, that people often notice their body's reaction before they even recognize the anxious thoughts causing it. This can lead to a vicious cycle. You panic about your body's response, which amplifies the anxiety. It becomes anxiety about anxiety, compounding the issue. Anxiety functions like an alarm system in the body, signaling potential danger, whether real or perceived. If your home alarm were going off, what would you do? First, you'd check for a real threat, scan your environment, and ground yourself in the present. Next, you'd turn off the alarm, use breathing exercises or mindfulness techniques like body scans. Finally, you'd investigate what triggered the alarm, examine the thoughts or situations that your brain interpreted as dangerous. It's also important to remember that danger doesn't have to mean a life-threatening event like someone pulling a gun on you. For example, panicking during a presentation could feel just as dangerous because it threatens your job, income, and stability. Reframing what triggers the anxiety can be key to managing it effectively. Story 9. I work in an older adult service for people with dementia and mental health problems, and I often see family members or carers feeling ashamed for finding it incredibly difficult to care for their loved ones. Watching someone you love struggle daily or slowly fade away over months is heartbreaking and exhausting, and carer burnout is a very real issue. Many carers feel like they should be able to handle everything, but the truth is that no one is superhuman. Everyone has their own needs, and it's okay to acknowledge that caring for someone with dementia or chronic mental health problems is overwhelming. Carers need time for themselves, and they need to know that it's okay to feel frustrated, sad, or even resentful at times. These feelings don't mean they love the person any less. That's why we have therapy groups specifically for carers. It's crucial to let them know they aren't alone, and that struggling doesn't make them failures. It makes them human. Story 10. One of the scariest issues I've encountered is how positive growth in outpatient therapy can sometimes decrease a person's priority for care, particularly in low-income clinic settings. I've experienced this firsthand and seen it happen to others. Therapists in these clinics are often overworked, and the demand for services is so high that they sometimes can't provide long-term care for people with chronic conditions. If you show signs of improvement, there's often a subtle push to transition you out of therapy to make room for new patients, even if you're not ready to leave. This is especially difficult for people with severe, long-term mental health needs. Personally, I know I'll likely need some form of treatment for the rest of my life. However, finding consistent, long-term care is nearly impossible. Private practices that accept my insurance are far away, and I'm left relying on clinics which are understaffed and overwhelmed. These clinics often take a get you in, fix you as best we can, get you out approach to manage their patient load, but it leaves people like me without the ongoing support we need. The result? Positive growth becomes fragile, and many people relapse after being pushed out of care. I've left therapy 3 times as an adult for these exact reasons, only to find myself back at square one within 6 months each time. It's a cycle that disproportionately affects lower-income individuals, leaving many without the resources they need to maintain progress. I don't know if this issue exists outside of the US, but here it's a harsh reality. For those in need of long-term outpatient care, showing signs of improvement can ironically put them at risk of losing access to the support that made that growth possible in the first place. It's a system that fails so many. Story 11. I'm finishing up my doctorate in clinical psychology and primarily work in forensic assessments, ranging from insanity and competency evaluations to cases involving abused children who need to be excused from testifying. A significant part of this work involves listening to people share deeply personal experiences, and I've noticed certain topics that clients often feel ashamed to discuss, even though they're incredibly common. One of these topics is stool abuse, particularly how it affects their current stool functioning. Many people struggle with feelings of shame around this and find it hard to open up. Another area is self-harm, which is also common in this field, but is often kept hidden. During my first year of practicum, I had a client who really desensitized me to the unexpected. He told me he collected roadkill and spent hours fantasizing about murdering specific people in his life. He wasn't just disturbing. There was a profoundly creepy, almost indescribable vibe about him that still gives me shivers when I think about it. That experience ripped the Band-Aid off for me, And after working with him, I feel like I've seen and heard just about everything. Even though these moments can be unsettling, they've taught me the importance of creating a safe space for clients to share their struggles without fear of judgment. Everyone deserves to be heard, no matter how difficult their story may be. Story 12. In all the years I've worked in this field, there are a few things I feel compelled to emphasize. First, incestuous stool abuse is more common than many people realize, and it is never okay. If you choose to process this kind of abuse with your therapist, please know that they will not be disgusted or shocked. The guilt and shame surrounding this type of trauma can be absolutely crushing. And I want anyone reading this to understand, there is nothing wrong with you if you have been abused in this way. Something that often gets overlooked is that women and girls can also be perpetrators of stool abuse. This dynamic can add an entirely different layer of shame and self-doubt for survivors. Abuse can be perpetuated by siblings, parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, or even multiple family members, either at different times or concurrently. Tragically, it's not uncommon for families to be aware of the abuse, but fail to intervene, or worse, blame the victim for what happened. If you've ever been stoolly abused, whether as a child or a teenager, it is not your fault. It is never your fault. As therapists, we hear about these experiences often, and we won't judge you or change how we see you. We're here to help you explore how this has affected you and support you in whatever way you feel ready for. Story 13. One of the most challenging topics for patients to disclose is family psychological abuse and sabotage. Scapegoated family members in particular often struggle to recognize the extent of the covert manipulation they've experienced throughout their lives. Scapegoats are rarely clued in to the family's ongoing manipulative secrets until they start searching online for phrases like, "Why does my mother hate me?" This search often provides just the basic insight they need to begin understanding their situation. In one case, a patient shared how his mother and sister had been actively sabotaging his life for years. They would reach out to his employers, friends, neighbors, and other important connections to slander him, creating rifts and tensions that disrupted every aspect of his life. The pattern was insidious. His mother and sister pretended to care about him, encouraging him to share personal details about his life. Then they would use that information to contact the people he mentioned, his employer, spouse, neighbors, or professors, and express false concerns about him. This manipulation led to countless losses for the patient, including job terminations, broken relationships, and other upheavals. The sabotage was so relentless that it eventually caused the patient to develop paranoid symptoms. However, these fears weren't unfounded. His mother and sister were actively working behind the scenes to cause problems in every facet of his life. It wasn't until much later that the patient began to connect the dots. Friends, spouses, and others had occasionally mentioned that his mother or sister had contacted them, but the patient hadn't realized how deeply this behavior had affected his life until it was corroborated by multiple sources. For example, a former college friend, now an MD, confirmed that the mother used to call them during school breaks and act overly familiar, saying, "It was weird. She would talk to me like we were friends or something." This case highlighted the devastating impact of covert familial sabotage and the importance of uncovering and validating these experiences. Once the patient understood the deliberate manipulation he'd been subjected to, he was able to begin the process of healing and rebuilding his life. Story 14. One of the most common things clients find too embarrassing to bring up in therapy is having stool or romantic thoughts about me as their therapist. Often they wait until the very end of therapy to disclose it, and we end up having a meaningful conversation about how normal it is. I remember one client who said it seemed strange to him because he was pretty sure he was straight. Over time, he realized that his feelings weren't about stool attraction, but stemmed from his unfamiliarity with feeling loved and accepted. He hadn't learned to conceptualize those emotions outside of a stool framework, which was a huge insight for him. I can only think of one counterexample where a therapist in training got shocked. A client told him that he compulsively masturbated to or on food. It was one of the student's first clients, and the situation made him extremely uncomfortable. In the end, that student realized therapy wasn't the right career for him. But for most therapists, we hear people's deepest secrets every day. Humanity is wonderfully weird, and we often celebrate clients' hidden quirks. It's unlikely to surprise us, but it's always an honor to witness those moments of vulnerability. Story 15. Over the last 5 years, I've noticed a significant rise in clients with persecution complexes. While people seem less afraid to discuss it now, it's far more frequent than it used to be. What's striking is that these clients come from all walks of life. On the outside, they seem fine, handling life as well as anyone else. But once the door closes and they start talking, the depth of their fears becomes clear. Some of their concerns are graphic and deeply upsetting, and I often struggle to hold back tears while listening. Many of these fears stem from a combination of personal isolation, media coverage of police injustices, and societal unrest. Clients internalize these issues to the point where they believe they're inherently bad people, and that others, particularly the police, can see it too. This often leads to debilitating anxiety, such as being afraid to leave the house because they think they'll be killed by the police. While these fears might seem irrational to some, for these clients, they completely control their daily lives. They spend hours reading about global tragedies like the Rohingya genocide and spiral into believing the same thing will happen to them next. This sensitivity to doom and tragedy has become a widespread issue. For those who are especially attuned to these events, it's vital to create space to process their feelings before jumping to catastrophic conclusions. The good news is that this can be worked on with time, trust, and a conscious effort to step away from the news and the internet. Progress is possible, but it requires a lot of care and patience. Story 16. When I worked in a treatment facility, I noticed that patients often found it difficult to share negative experiences they'd had within the facility. For example, our psychiatrist would sometimes spend entire sessions talking about her own family instead of letting patients discuss their issues. There was also a nurse who treated patients disrespectfully, as though they were just drug addicts rather than people. Even though I developed strong rapport with many of my patients, very few opened up about being mistreated in the facility. It made me realize how hard it is for patients to feel comfortable bringing up concerns about staff. If you trust your therapist, please know that you can and should bring up concerns like these. We genuinely care about how you're treated, and we want to help. Not only can we work on addressing the issue directly, but we can also support you in coping with any feelings or reactions you've had as a result. Your voice matters, and your treatment experience should reflect that. Story 17. I work as a therapist at an addiction treatment hospital, and I've found that clients are often embarrassed to share two main things: the extreme lengths they've gone to obtain substances and how deeply they're struggling emotionally. Many of my clients have lived through incredibly intense experiences and are surprisingly open about those events. However, when it comes to showing personal vulnerability, like sharing their grief after a friend's overdose, or admitting they performed suicidal acts in exchange for drugs, it takes much longer to build the trust needed for those conversations. This isn't unique to addiction treatment. Across all populations, I've noticed that people are often quick to talk about what happens around them, but hesitate to discuss what's going on inside them. When clients finally let those feelings out, they almost always say they feel relieved, like a weight has been lifted. I often remind clients, you've told me about the terrible things people have done to you. It's normal and natural for you to have emotional reactions to those experiences. If anyone reading this is holding something back in therapy, I encourage you to let it out. That's exactly what therapy is for. We're trained to listen without judgment and to provide support no matter what you're going through. In my experience, opening up only strengthens the therapeutic relationship and leads to meaningful discussions that can be truly transformative. Story 18. I once had a patient who confessed that he had an unusual obsession. He needed to touch at least 10 different ceilings per day. He kept a ladder in his vehicle at all times and would make it his mission to touch the ceiling of every business or home he entered. To pull this off, he often disguised himself as a handyman, pretending to fix ceiling tiles or replace light bulbs. If business owners confronted him, he would confidently claim that he'd been sent by corporate. His dedication didn't stop there. At church, he would wait until the entire congregation left, haul in his ladder, and even use the pews as support to reach the ceilings. He was relentless in his pursuit, and anything less than 10 ceilings per day was simply unacceptable. When the pandemic hit and businesses and churches shut down, his anxiety skyrocketed. He became desperate to maintain his ceiling routine, but struggled to find viable options. Grocery stores were out of the question due to their high ceilings, and breaking into businesses after hours felt too risky. At one point, he even considered buying 10 outdoor sheds to place in his backyard, but that plan failed because he lived in an apartment. Ultimately, he decided to make a drastic life change. He quit his job as a taxidermist and started an appliance repair company. This allowed him to visit 10 different homes a day, where he could easily fulfill his ceiling-touching goal. He worked long hours, around 70 per week, and made much less money than before. He also admitted there was one unexpected upside to his new career. His wife divorced him because he was never home. After the divorce, he stopped coming to therapy. I can only assume that, in his mind, the major changes in his life meant he no longer needed the sessions. While I'll never know what became of him, I often think about how resourceful and determined he was, even if his goals were unconventional, to say the least. Story 19. As an early career trainee, my pool of experiences is still growing, but I've noticed a trend with suicidal ideation, SI. Clients often initially claim there's nothing of concern, only to later admit, sometimes with shame, that they've had passive thoughts of suicide like, life would be so much easier if I weren't here. The truth is, these types of thoughts are incredibly common, and nearly all of us have had them at some point. It's understandable why clients might feel hesitant to disclose these thoughts. In therapy, we're legally and ethically required to explain that confidentiality could be breached if we hear thoughts or plans of self-harm or harm to others. This means the topic is discussed with gravity, often leaving clients worried about the potential consequences of opening up. For instance, the situation is taken most seriously when there's an active plan or a date set, which can lead to actions like involving the police. In my own therapy, I remember being asked about SI during an intake session. My response was something like, well, not more than the 20,000 times since I was born when I thought it might end the pain of existence. My therapist laughed and shared that he could relate, which felt like an appropriate response given our rapport. That small moment of connection helped normalize those thoughts for me. For clients, it's important to know that passive thoughts of suicide don't automatically lead to intervention or breaches of confidentiality. Therapists are trained to explore these thoughts with care, aiming to understand and support rather than judge or escalate unnecessarily. If you've experienced these thoughts, sharing them in therapy can open the door to relief and deeper understanding. It's a safe space to express those feelings without shame. Story 20. A lot of drug use and self-medicating tends to be brushed under the rug, often by people who are either afraid of legal trouble or who don't see themselves as drug users. I've worked with many clients who are ashamed to admit they've used street drugs. Often, they'll frame it as something they tried once or in the past, but over time it comes out that they're still using. It's hard for many neurotypical adults to understand how self-medicating works, or to acknowledge that it can seem effective at first until it eventually stops working. Many successful professionals unknowingly use substances like coca or meth to manage undiagnosed ADHD, anxiety, or depression. Others turn to alcohol or opioids, unintentionally trying to correct chemical imbalances from depressive episodes. Most people simply think, I like the way this makes me feel, without connecting it to an underlying issue. Sometimes even less thought goes into using legal substances like alcohol or prescribed narcotics. However, knowing a client's drug of choice can be a powerful diagnostic tool. It can reveal important clues about their brain chemistry and what types of treatment might be effective for them. Even something as simple as whether a client prefers uppers or downers can tell us a lot. Unfortunately, the stigma and shame surrounding illegal drugs often stop people from being honest about their experiences. Clients may hesitate to admit that they truly enjoyed how they felt the one time they smoked Hero, for example. If you're in therapy and self-medicating in any form, street drugs, alcohol, or even overusing prescribed medications, know that being open about it can help your therapist better understand your needs and provide effective support without judgment. Story 21. I've noticed many parents struggle to be honest about parenting, particularly when working with families dealing with young children who have behavioral concerns. Almost without fail, these parents claim to love their children unconditionally to an extreme degree. For example, they'll say things like, I don't even get mad at them, as if getting frustrated or mishandling a situation is a sign of failure. They're also hesitant to admit they want more help or could use new parenting strategies. This always surprises me because even as someone trained in parent-child specialty areas who has children of my own and teaches parenting classes, I'm constantly looking for ways to learn and improve. Wanting to do better isn't a weakness, it's a strength. What worries me more is when parents refuse to acknowledge room for improvement. That mindset limits growth and can lead to negative consequences for both the parent and the child. It's okay to make mistakes, to feel like you could be doing better, or to want more tools and support. That's how you grow. Another thing I've noticed is that many parents feel guilty about taking time away from their kids, even briefly. They worry it makes them bad parents. But stepping away for a night, leaving the kids with a family member or babysitter, is incredibly healthy. It helps prevent burnout and allows parents to recharge, which benefits the entire family. Parenting is tough and it's okay to need help, make mistakes, or take a break. Admitting these things is a step toward being the best parent you can be. Story 22. One of the hardest things to admit is having an addiction, especially when you're deep in it, or it's your primary coping mechanism for dealing with other painful aspects of your life, mental illness, or post-traumatic stress. For many of us with addictive tendencies, our bodies naturally gravitate toward behaviors or substances that provide a dopamine or serotonin rush or some other relaxing endorphin release. In my case, the hardest thing to confront was my binge eating disorder. Throughout the years I practiced these destructive behaviors, I convinced myself they were helpful. I rationalized overeating as a reward for having a bad day, or as a form of nutrition that would somehow make me a better person. I gave food far more power over me than it actually had, and this negative feedback loop consumed me. This struggle was deeply rooted in my upbringing. My mother had an eating disorder herself and would sometimes starve us as kids. Her behavior shaped my relationship with food and my body in profound ways. To make matters worse, I developed a genetic condition caused by maternal starvation during pregnancy. This condition makes it easy to gain weight and increases testosterone levels, which only exacerbated my mother's frustration and inability to control my weight through conventional means. For years, I sought help in the wrong places. Weight loss surgeons, counselors employed by their clinics, and other professionals failed to recognize my binge eating disorder as the core issue. It wasn't until I sought treatment at a dedicated eating disorder clinic, where a specialized doctor, nutritionist, and counselor worked together, that I began to heal. Addictions, especially ones seen as non-evil, like gaming, gambling, or food addictions, often serve as our final line of defense against unaddressed trauma or subconscious pain. These behaviors protect us from facing the bad things buried deep within us. For me, food became an easy, accessible way to soothe my emotions while also shielding me from external scrutiny. As I pursued a psychology degree in 2012, I learned more about how childhood, post-traumatic stress shapes brain chemistry and contributes to the development of addictive disorders. These addictions, including food-related ones, are often coping mechanisms for unmet needs or emptiness created by a parent's behavior. Food addiction in particular is one of the hardest to admit because food is so easily accessible and socially normalized. Disorders like anorexia and bulimia, though seemingly opposite, stem from the same root pathology, regardless of whether the person is fat, thin, or average. If you're struggling with food addiction or feel trapped by the pressure to control your weight, don't be afraid to talk about it. But I strongly encourage seeking out a specialized eating disorder therapist before pursuing extreme measures like weight loss surgery. With the right help, you can address not just the surface issue, but also the underlying pain driving the behavior, allowing you to reclaim your life and pursue the things you truly want. Story 23. I'm a clinical therapist in private practice, and this is a topic I've thought about deeply. I've even discussed it several times with my wife, who is a school psychologist. Conversations in our house are always interesting. As a therapist, I pay close attention to the questions I ask and how I respond. Words carry weight, not just meaning. They can influence how someone interprets or internalizes a conversation. This is especially important in therapy, where people often feel vulnerable. When I think about the kinds of topics people hesitate to disclose, it's not always just fear of judgment. Sometimes it's anxiety, shame, or the fear of making their experiences feel too real by saying them out loud. Denial and other psychological defense mechanisms often play a role here. People may feel they're not ready to process these experiences yet, and that's perfectly okay. Therapy is about meeting people where they are and building a foundation of trust and safety before diving into the harder topics. Common hesitations include a wide range of issues like sexual assault, both victims and perpetrators, abortion, religious guilt, and thoughts of harm, whether passive or active. People may hold back because they think their experiences are weird or worry that their therapist will think so. For the record, nothing is truly weird to a compassionate, professional therapist. Some clients also worry about being judged, treated differently, or even reported to the authorities. It's worth clarifying that HIPAA laws protect confidentiality, and only imminent harm to oneself or others can break that confidentiality, not past behaviors or crimes. One of the most powerful tools in therapy is normalization. Letting someone know through empathy and understanding that their feelings and reactions are not only valid but common helps create a safe space to explore those experiences further. Normalization doesn't minimize the impact of an event. It provides reassurance that they are not alone or irreparably different because of it. Every story is unique, yet in some way, every story is also common. This paradox of human experience is what can ultimately unite us. It reminds us that, while each person's journey is personal, no one's struggles are truly alien. Therapy works best when it fosters this sense of connection and understanding, showing that even the most difficult topics are okay to talk about and worthy of attention. Story 24. I'm not a therapist, but a client. I have emetophobia and ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, because of it. For the longest time, I didn't even realize I had an eating disorder, because mine wasn't tied to body dysmorphia or concerns about weight. My fear was of nausea, throwing up, and anything related to that. I spent a lot of time being bounced around, confused about what was wrong with me. Anytime I'd mention my fear of vomiting, I'd get the same dismissive response. No one likes that. It made me feel so isolated, like my phobia was completely unique and utterly bizarre. When I was eventually hospitalized for my eating disorder, part of my discharge plan was to continue outpatient therapy. That's when I met my current therapist. I was absolutely terrified to tell her about my phobia because I was convinced it was so weird and unrelatable. In my first session, I sat down and blurted out, "I'm about to tell you the craziest thing. I know you probably can't help me, and I know it's stupid and insane, but I'm afraid to throw up. Not just like I don't like it, but like my heart pounds, I cry, and I can't breathe if my stomach even grumbles." She sat there silently for what felt like the longest 30 seconds of my life. Then she finally said, "I thought you were going to tell me you're really a mermaid and a sea witch tried to steal your voice." For context, my hair is bright red. Then she added, "I hate to inform you that you are absolutely, positively, blandly normal. You don't pass the crazy test, sorry." Her response instantly made me feel less crazy. It was exactly what I needed to hear. She normalized my experience and made me feel seen without dismissing the seriousness of what I was going through. She's still my therapist today, and she's a damn good one. That first conversation showed me how powerful a good therapist's empathy and humor can be in helping you feel safe and understood. Story 25. I'm a psychologist, and the short answer to what are people afraid to admit in therapy is everything. By that, I mean that after a certain point in our careers, there's very little that can weird us out, even if it's something we've never encountered before. Personally, I've worked with literal cannibals and pedophiles, so in terms of weird or disturbing behavior, it's hard to imagine something that could go further. Everything else pales in comparison. That doesn't mean the experiences clients bring to therapy aren't significant. Quite the opposite. Even if it feels unremarkable to me, it's deeply meaningful to the person sharing it, and that's what matters. Whether it's hearing voices, thinking about suicide or harming someone else, exploring unusual kinks or fetishes, or harboring resentment toward a loved one, it all falls within the full spectrum of human experience. As therapists, our job is to hold space for all of it. Currently, I work exclusively with teenage girls. As a male therapist, I often encounter initial hesitancy or embarrassment when they disclose sensitive topics. These range from seemingly simple things like, "I think my depression gets worse during my period," to more private concerns like, "I'm not enjoying masturbation as much as I used to." My role is to make sure my patients feel comfortable and know that none of this phases me. I'm here to talk about anything because that's what therapy is for. If you're holding back something you feel ashamed of, please know that therapists are trained for this. We're here to listen, not judge. Whatever it is, we're ready to talk about it with you. Story 26. I've come to realize that so many of the things people feel ashamed of are more common than they think. For example, a surprising number of millennials share a similar experience tied to the early days of cable and on-demand TV, specifically the accessibility of adult content. When Comcast and similar services became popular, many parents didn't realize that their kids could access adult channels, nor did they think their children even knew about them. But many kids did, and some were exposed to porn at a very young age. For some, this led to early addiction-like behaviors, where they sought increasingly explicit material to achieve the same effect, much like with substance use. Studies suggest that millennials may have higher rates of porn addiction compared to other generations, and I wouldn't be surprised if this early exposure is a contributing factor. Over the years, I've spoken to several people who've shared similar experiences, and many have carried shame about it into adulthood. They've also often struggled with how this early exposure shaped their views on relationships, and self-esteem. It's important to recognize that these experiences, while private, are far more common than people realize. If you're carrying shame about something like this, know that it's okay to talk about it in therapy. You're not alone, and addressing it can lead to a deeper understanding of yourself and healing from those experiences. Story 27. Shame is one of the most powerful barriers to progress in therapy. Sharing material wrapped in shame often feels like losing control, which can be almost unbearable. In a way, opening up about shame feels like handing over a helpless, vulnerable infant to the therapist, trusting them to handle it with care. This is why finding the right therapist is so crucial. While many are technically proficient, only some possess both skill and the talent for creating a truly safe, compassionate environment. Through therapy, many people come to a profound realization. They didn't have a choice in the behaviors or incidents that now carry shame. By reflecting on their psychological state at the time, they begin to accept and grieve what happened. They realize they would handle things differently today, but also that they couldn't have acted otherwise in the past. This self-awareness leads to forgiveness and empathy for the version of themselves who endured so much pain and difficulty. However, the past doesn't simply vanish. Instead, we integrate it into our ongoing story, adding depth and meaning to our lives as we move forward. It's worth noting that this process of acceptance, while valuable for many struggles, may not fully apply to the context of sexual assault or other traumas discussed earlier. Each journey of healing is unique. Story 28. When I worked with caregivers of older Asian adults with dementia, one of the most common struggles they shared was the tension between feeling completely burned out from caregiving and the belief that they weren't doing enough. This worry about caregiving performance is a heavy burden, but it's rarely discussed. Cultural expectations, particularly the concept of filial piety, can make it even harder to talk about these struggles. Many caregivers worry they'll be seen as ungrateful or unloving if they admit they're overwhelmed. This fear often keeps them from seeking support, leaving them to shoulder the emotional and physical toll of caregiving alone. To anyone caring for a loved one with dementia, please know that your struggles are real and valid. Burnout is common because caregiving is incredibly difficult, no matter how much you love the person you're caring for. It's okay to acknowledge the challenges, and it's essential to find support, whether that's through a caregiver support group, therapy, or simply sharing your feelings with someone you trust. You're not alone in this journey. Seeking help isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of strength and self-care, both of which are critical to continuing to care for your loved one. Story 29. Some of the responses in this thread don't sound like they're coming from therapists, so I'll try to provide as clear and honest an answer as possible. The first challenge in therapy is when a client clearly does not want to help themselves. As a therapist, I can guide you, offer an objective perspective, help you reframe your experiences, and provide tools to manage your thoughts and energy. But I can't do the work for you. I can't start or end relationships, make you take your medication, or force you to stop destructive habits or adopt beneficial ones. These are your decisions. Even when the consequences of your choices are clear to me, they are ultimately up to you. The second challenge arises when I am not the right therapist for a client. Therapy is a deeply personal process, and the fit between client and therapist matters. My communication style, values, and personality may not align with the client's needs. Sometimes I've struggled with a client who went on to thrive with another therapist. Other times, I've worked well with clients who were frustrated by previous therapists. It's important to acknowledge that no therapist is the perfect fit for everyone, and finding the right match can make all the difference. The final challenge is when a client's pathology requires intensive or medical intervention. Therapy can't replace inpatient care when it's needed, nor can therapists prescribe medication. Inpatient care is often in short supply, and many clients resist it, but there are situations where I have to advise clients to complete an inpatient program before continuing therapy with me. I want to emphasize this. The idea that a therapist said I was too messed up to be helped is often a misinterpretation. Sometimes clients hear this because it fits a narrative they've internalized, but it's not what therapists mean. When we recommend another therapist or treatment course, we're saying, I am not the best person to help you, not you cannot be helped. Think of it like this. Most mechanics can work on most cars, but if you have a rare or specialized vehicle, you'll likely get better results from a mechanic with expertise in that brand. Therapy works the same way. I can't help you is not the same as you can't be helped. There's always hope, even if the path requires adjustments along the way. Story 30. I once cleaned house bi-weekly for a wonderful woman, one of my former college literature professors, who was battling severe depression. She had been seeing a therapist regularly, but one day she told me her therapist had let her go. When I asked why, she said the therapist claimed she smelled like mold, which was disrupting their respiratory system and required a full day to recover from. Hearing this was devastating for her. Not once had I ever noticed a bad smell, mold or otherwise, in her home, car, or on her. I was a meticulous cleaner who left no corner untouched, even vacuuming inside air vents and cleaning out every drawer. There was no sign of mold anywhere. The therapist's remark clearly cut deep. She sank further into her depression and struggled for months before finding the courage to seek help from another therapist. The experience left her feeling more vulnerable and mistrustful of the mental health process, making it even harder to reach out again. To this day, I feel so angry when I think about it. That therapist's behavior was unprofessional and cruel, and it made an already difficult battle with depression even harder. It's been years, but I still wish I could confront them for how much they hurt her. Story 31. I had a therapist drop me at one of the worst moments in my life after seeing her for a year and a half. She was the director of a psychiatric ward at a local hospital and did therapy on the side, supposedly to make a more direct impact. However, it became clear that therapy wasn't something she was truly committed to. She would constantly interrupt me during sessions and admitted she couldn't relate to my struggles because of her happy childhood. She grew frustrated when lifelong trauma couldn't be resolved in a single session and outright refused to address some of my issues, claiming I wasn't going to get better. Ironically, those issues weren't even as serious as others we'd covered. It felt like therapy was more about making her feel good, like she was doing a fun, fulfilling side gig, than actually helping me. 2 months after she dropped me, I had a serious panic attack. I eventually found a new therapist who was a much better fit. In just 6 months with this therapist, I've made more progress than I did in the entire year and a half with the previous one. The experience taught me how crucial it is to find the right therapist. A mismatch can make things worse, while a therapist who truly listens and understands can make all the difference. I'm so much happier now, and I finally feel like I'm on the right path. Story 32. I was the patient in this situation, not the therapist. While in university, I used the school's therapy services, which were staffed by PhD students completing their training. Because of this, therapists often came and went, but eventually I found one I really connected with. For the first time, I began opening up more than I ever had before. After one session where I shared deeply personal and difficult topics, she listened intently and then said something that broke my heart. I'm sorry, but I'm not qualified to handle cases like this. In fact, none of the therapists here are. I'm going to refer you to an excellent therapist outside the school, but I can no longer offer you treatment. I was stunned. Apparently, certain topics require the expertise of licensed professionals, which I hadn't known. If I had, I might have kept quiet. Despite her kind referral, I never got the treatment I hoped for. I tried a few therapists after that, but never found the same connection. I still think about her and hope she finished her PhD program and is out there helping others. While I could likely still benefit from therapy, I've grown used to handling my problems on my own. But part of me knows that truly opening up to the right therapist could help in ways I can't fully achieve alone. Story 33. I'm not a therapist, but I volunteered at a mental health cafe staffed by qualified counselors. It was designed as a crisis support space to provide an alternative to hospitalization for people experiencing mental health emergencies. Ambulance services would bring people in crisis to the cafe instead of A&E. During my time there, I attended training sessions on suicide and self-harm and had meetings with mental health experts. What I learned in those meetings has stayed with me ever since. The experts told us quite plainly that many patients they encountered couldn't be saved. They urged us to abandon the idea that we could save anyone because that expectation would crush us emotionally. They explained that keeping a patient alive wasn't necessarily saving them. Often, the focus was on encouraging patients away from suicide to prevent the pain and trauma from being passed on to their families. In many cases, the hour of conversation we offered was more like giving them metaphorical oxygen. The truth they didn't sugarcoat was that only the patient could save themselves, and sometimes they were already too far under to reach out for help. That realization hit hard, especially because they were, without knowing, describing my own mental health struggles. I stopped volunteering shortly after that. It was too much to bear at the time. Thankfully, my mental health has improved since then, but it has been declining again recently. Reading this thread has reminded me how important it is to reach out for help. I never want to return to that dark headspace, and I know now that seeking support is the first step to staying out of it. Story 34. I'm a behavior therapist who works with special needs children, focusing on helping them overcome learning and behavioral challenges to improve their quality of life. In my experience, I've never met a child I couldn't help, but unfortunately, I've encountered situations where a child couldn't remain in services due to major issues with their parents or family environment. Some parents say they want to help their child, but are unwilling to make any changes to their routines or lifestyle to accommodate their child's unique needs. Recommendations for learning strategies or health interventions are often ignored. In other cases, parents treat therapy sessions like babysitting, showing little investment in the process or the outcomes. There are even parents who seem threatened by the progress their child makes in therapy. It's as though they can't handle the fact that positive changes are happening because of the therapist's work rather than their own. These parents sometimes sabotage the progress between sessions, undermining everything their child has achieved. It's heartbreaking to see these situations unfold because it's the child who suffers most. Over time, I've learned the painful but necessary lesson that when progress is consistently sabotaged or ignored, it's time to walk away. That time could be spent helping another family that is ready to invest in their child's future. Story 35. I have a friend who has been in a continuous crisis for about 3 years, to the point where she's barely able to function. During this time, she has systematically sabotaged every single attempt to help her, from casual support to therapy, inpatient care, medication, and even live-in care. She spends immense amounts of energy rationalizing why nothing and no one can help her, often bombarding her support network with messages about how she just needs to die. Her statements are often contradictory and filled with untruths. For example, she might claim she hasn't eaten in days, or that paramedics ignored a noose hanging in her home, claims that are easily disproven when those in her network communicate. Despite this, she fully believes what she's saying in the moment, only to contradict herself minutes later to justify avoiding another action. It's heartbreaking because it's clear she's terrified of change and self-sufficiency. She's stuck in a cycle of learned helplessness, where she manipulates her friends and support network to maintain the status quo. At this point, her refusal to take even small steps toward change has created a pattern of stagnation and despair. While I feel immense compassion for her, it's painfully evident that no amount of external support will help unless she's willing to take the first step toward breaking the cycle. Sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that change can only happen when the person is ready to embrace it themselves. Story 36. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I want to clarify something. The idea that some people are entirely beyond help isn't accurate. I've worked with a wide range of clients, from those who need medication, in which case I refer them to a psychiatrist and continue therapy, to court-mandated clients who don't want to be there. These situations can be challenging, especially with teenagers who resist therapy and sometimes even run away rather than finish their sessions. In every scenario, I try to do my best and meet the client where they are, understanding that meaningful progress depends on their willingness to engage in the process. Therapy is a lot like personal training. A therapist knows what needs to be done and can guide you, but ultimately, the client is the one lifting the weights. If they refuse to put in the effort, progress is limited. However, I've found that even the most difficult clients can be helped if they're showing up and willing to try, even in small ways. That said, there are clients who seem stuck in an endless cycle they can't break. These individuals often stay in therapy for years. While they may improve, they might never complete therapy. Instead, therapy becomes about helping them process life as it happens, whether it's dealing with ongoing grief, trauma, or simply having a safe space to be heard. Many people don't have friends or family who can listen without judgment or making it about themselves. Sometimes being that empathetic, compassionate listener is the most valuable role a therapist can play, even if there's no clear finish line. Story 37. I'm not a therapist, but my first experience with therapy taught me a lot about the importance of finding the right fit. I realized we were mismatched when my therapist told me I was generally well-adjusted, as long as a few good things were happening in my life. That assessment felt dismissive, and while I had no trouble being open about certain topics, there were deeper concerns, like a possible eating disorder, that I couldn't find the courage to bring up. The problem was that she seemed to take all her cues from me. I expected therapy to be a push and pull dynamic where my thoughts and patterns were challenged, but instead, she just agreed with everything I said. While I did get a much-needed ADHD diagnosis, her advice boiled down to, just do it, which felt like a slap in the face given that not being able to just do it was the core issue I needed help with. I was still depressed, listless, and unable to find anything to anchor myself to. I planned to quit therapy, but before I could, she left the entire practice for a break. The process of finding someone new has felt so exhausting that I haven't tried again. What I need is a partner, someone who can help me untangle the mess of my thoughts, identify the things I'm doing that are keeping me stuck, and introduce actionable steps to create better habits and a kinder relationship with myself. I need practical how-tos and guidance. Is that too much to ask? Therapy feels like such a long, exhausting road, and I'm still holding out hope that the right therapist can help me navigate it. Story 38. I'm a therapist working with individuals who have severe and persistent mental illnesses. My team provides mobile and intensive services, and as a result, I've worked with many people for years. However, there are cases where I've realized I can't help much within the limits of my skill set. One common scenario is working with elderly clients experiencing significant cognitive decline. At a certain point, therapy transitions into more of a social support role. I'm there to provide some companionship and manage their cases, ensuring they get the appropriate services. Therapeutically, there's not much I can do to improve their situation. Eventually, they often move into a nursing home with a dementia unit, and I don't see them again. Another scenario is when someone is actively resistant to therapy. This often happens with court-mandated clients, individuals forced into therapy by legal guardians, or situations where payee services only communicate with clients through us. In these cases, I focus on building common ground, developing rapport, and meeting them where they are. I try to approach them with radical openness, but sometimes the grievances between us or the circumstances surrounding their treatment make meaningful progress nearly impossible. Mandatory therapy is especially challenging when insurance or managed care systems don't allow clients to switch therapists. It's not that these clients can't be helped, it's that my team or I may not be the right fit, and external factors like insurance policies create barriers to finding someone who could help them better. I've worked with individuals dealing with significant psychosis, severe personality disorders, and other serious challenges. Yet I've never felt anyone was beyond all help. There's always potential for someone to benefit from the right person in the right environment. My role is to try, and if I can't help, to recognize when it's time to connect them with someone or something that can. It's humbling, but important to know when we aren't the best fit, even as we keep doing our best in the meantime.